David Moody, CEO of National Disability Services, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel.
It's great to have you here and talking today about the disruptions in the community sector, and particularly with a disability services flavour. But before we get into it, I'd love to hear a little bit, David, about you and NDIS itself and the what and the why of the organisation. But what's your journey into the role?
I started off life as a workers' compensation litigation lawyer, working at a leading Melbourne law firm representing injured workers. That gave me a great deal of exposure to the importance of social justice on behalf of and working with people with acquired injuries, and by reason of that with disability in many cases. It really gave me a real-time appreciation of the impact of disability on a person's life and the challenges that people with those sort of acquired injuries often face in actually continuing to be part of their community, part of work, part of life. I was fortunate enough to be appointed the Assistant Director responsible for the Secretariat, and in that capacity, together with my team at Premier and Cabinet in Victoria, coordinated Victoria's contribution to the development of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. From there, moving on to the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria, a department which I just respect the work of that department so much because of the nature of the work that it does with people in the community who are often in very vulnerable situations. I was there as Director of Budget Strategy and Corporate Planning for a couple of years before then being fortunate enough to commence working at National Disability Services, initially as a Victorian State Manager, and since February of last year as Acting CEO at NDIS and now CEO at National Disability Services. So that's my journey in a nutshell. The NDIS, I think we can all agree, is an immature scheme. A lot is hoped for it, and not all of those hopes have been delivered upon. But in terms of its potential and in terms of the purpose, when it's working as intended, it will be life-changing, and it already is in many cases, but will certainly be life-changing for anything up to, at the moment, 500,000 Australians, their families, their carers, their supporters. And of course, for providers in the sector, and obviously National Disability Services represents those providers. We'd like to think that we're actually influencing and driving some of the disruption and supporting our members, disability service providers, in not so much disrupting the lives of, but rather optimising the ability of people with disability to live ordinary lives. And that's, again, utterly consistent with the objective of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. National Disability Services, as the peak body for non-government disability service providers, has at this time 1,180 organisational members in every state and territory in Australia. We have members who literally have been providing disability services of one form or another for 40 or 50, sometimes 70 years it seems, and have remodelled themselves to accommodate the new paradigm of the NDIS, a consumer-driven care and support model of disability service provision. And it's possibly a sad commentary, given that we're a country which is still deinstitutionalising in some parts. Being able to support people with disability to socially participate in their community in a really active way in some parts of the country would still be regarded as a little bit radical. We're seeing the continued growth of mental health peer workers, and by that I mean, for those who might be unaware of the concept, people with a history of mental illness themselves who are being employed by mental health service providers to support others with mental illness and mental health issues. There's nothing like empathy, having once been in the shoes of the person you're supporting, I'm sure, to optimise your ability to support them in a very, very tangible way. We have providers who, in training their workforce, rely upon virtual reality tools to support potential disability support workers to understand what it is to be a disability support worker working in the sector. I've personally been involved in at least one project which developed that virtual reality type tool, and was fascinated by just how far the technology has come even in the last few years. I actually asked to try on the goggles and actually use the virtual reality. I found myself almost engaged in a conversation with a woman who was inviting me into the virtual reality space without actually thinking, hang on a second, this person isn't real. But that was fascinating, because what it allowed the viewer to do is to literally be standing alongside a disability support worker in the kitchen as they were supporting a person with disability to make a meal. There are at least some of our larger providers who are using virtual reality as a training tool for their current workforce, and not just as providing a gateway to understanding what it is to be a disability support worker for those who aren't part of the sector. We know that technology is by definition a disruptor across a range of sectors. A number of our providers got on early with supporting their workforce to better use mobile devices so that they could work in the home and remotely from a centre, allowing those workers to record their hours, record the outcomes they were achieving together with the person with disability, enabling the person with disability they were supporting to actually sign off on the service they'd received, etc., etc.
Allow me to draw out a little bit more of that, David.
Sure.
You've got a crystal ball, of course.
Yep.
Where do you see some of those disruptions going in the next year, couple of years, 5 years?
I think particularly with Gen Y and Gen Z parents and Gen Y and Gen Z people with disability, in terms of the future direction of disability employment, I think there will always be a continuum of employment options for people with disability to access. I think increasingly people with disability will be looking for more opportunities to be supported to experiment with different employment types. At one point in their life, they and their parents might be particularly interested in supported employment options. Other times in their life, they'll be interested in at least dipping their toe into the pond of open employment options. At other times, they'll be interested in establishing themselves as a micro or social enterprise. And I think that providers who are able to actually meet those expectations by providing a seamless experience across a number of different employment domains are going to find themselves very well positioned to support the clients of the future in this space. I think that we're increasingly going to see the mainstreaming of people with disability in education. I don't say that special schools will disappear anytime in the immediate future, but I do think that increasingly we're aware of the importance of education being provided in mainstream settings for everybody in the community as far as is reasonably possible. I think we're going to see virtual reality and other tools being used to support people with particular types of cognitive and indeed autism spectrum disorder disabilities, ASD disabilities, to actually practice how to engage with people in community in ways which then give them more confidence to be part of the real world, if you will. I think that there's going to be a whole industry in the development of assistive technology and cutting edge technology. And I say that knowing, and we all know this, I think now, that so often technology that's been developed for people with disability eventually has seeped into the wider culture anyway. I think we're going to see a greater level of alignment and seamlessness between health and disability, mental health and disability, and the like. And I think we're going to see that in part because of the experience we've recently had of the pandemic and the importance of recognising that people with disability require health services too. With an ageing population, the incidence of people with disability in our community will also increase commensurately. Yeah. I think that increasingly health professionals and health organisations will come to embrace the reality that many of the people that they're treating as patients will have a disability, and that therefore we will see over time in the future a heightened awareness in the health sector as to how to support people with disability in health. We'll see an international community working more seamlessly together around identifying what's next in terms of disability services and supports and provision. And that's because we can have conversations like this one on Zoom or Teams or whatever. The marketisation of community services, including disability, this notion of consumer-driven care and support is certainly of interest to other parts of the world. And the fact that you have a single cohort of people, a community of 500,000 Australians, all of whom are clients of or participants in the same scheme, I think will inevitably make us very attractive for the purpose of research and understanding. And certainly this is something which National Disability Services is very keen to see happen and wants to drive. And that is that we're going to get a really rich store of data and information. You can probably tell I'm a big supporter of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that's in part because it is underpinned by actuarial analysis and a focus on outcomes. That particular focus makes it very ripe, in my view, for careful analysis to understand things which are really tangible and which really matter. Historically, I don't think you can talk about a marketised approach to community services which is fully marketised when in fact there remains a schedule of prices. What we don't want is a deregulation of prices which leads to a race to the bottom in terms of quality. The second thing is, and at least as important, is that via price deregulation, we do not want to see, nor do we support, price gouging of people with disability and the funding in their plans. Thirdly of all, we would say that there is a case still for piloting the concept of price deregulation in particular types of supports in particular regions just to see how it works, with appropriate caveats and underpinning safeguards. Our members are working to a schedule of prices for the most part, rather than being able to quote. That creates all sorts of issues because of the assumptions which underpin those prices. Assumptions around what quality looks like and how it's achieved, assumptions such as the number of workers who are supervised at any one time. The assumption that currently underpins prices for certain supports in the scheme is that there would be one manager for 15 FTE, where once the assumption was one manager for 11 FTE. Now the challenge in that space is, of course, that the vast majority, probably 80% of workers in the sector are working part-time. So when you're talking about headcount rather than FTE, you're talking about the potential for one manager to 25 or 30 workers. Assumptions around training, for example, at a time when we're trying to not just grow the workforce in terms of quantum, but grow it in terms of its quality over time. The assumption underpinning the price at the moment is 2 days of training for a full-time worker per year and half a day's training for a part-time worker. If that assumption stands and is applied to prices, I'm not sure that it offers much by way of a training opportunity, a funded training opportunity in any given year. The assumption is still, as I recall, 95% of the workers' time will be face-to-face time. That we would argue is unrealistic. I mean, in most organisations outside the sector, you would be assuming face-to-face time for virtually any service of something closer to 70 or 80% rather than 95%.
David, you said before that the NDIS is not really an insurance scheme as it stands. Do you unpack that a little for us?
Sure. I think a fair assessment would say at the moment is that it's a trainingly funded government agency, funded in part by the Commonwealth, funded in part by the states and territories. It's not a social insurance scheme insofar as a social insurance scheme would be funding people based upon the concept of lifetime care and support. I don't think on any argument you'd say that the scheme is adopting that approach in the way it's funding supports at the moment. A lifetime care and support approach would, amongst other things, front load funding for people with disability, and particularly young people with disability, in order to, over their lives, divert them from having to access more expensive tertiary supports later in life. Just the fact the thing is, the scheme is still operating in ways which are changing the lives of people with disability in many cases, with great credit going to the disability service providers being funded under the scheme to support those people with disability is a great thing.
David, shifting gears a little, there are some new players popping up, of course, across the disability sector. And some of those have a very different shape to the historical players. So just as an example, Higher Up is a very IT-based setup. I believe they have something like 45 IT developers and the company is growing. What do you see in the landscape that's shifting around how disability service providers are going to market?
It's funny you should mention Higher Up. I was only having a chat with its CEO, Jordan O'Reilly, this morning, as a matter of fact. In its establishment of Jordan and his sister, Laura, their desire to establish a company to provide disability services for people with disability, which in its underpinning principles leveraged off the negative experience that their brother had in having, as Jordan has described it in other places, disability support workers just cycling through all the time, rather than having people who could become familiar with and supporting him with his disability. They're a very customer-centric organisation, and one which I'm proud to say is also an organisational associate of National Disability Services, which continues to directly employ the vast majority of their workforce, which I think is notable in the current environment. There are other platform-based organisations which are springing up. One of the things I really want to emphasise is what NDS isn't about is prescribing what's appropriate and what isn't when it comes to the entry of particular services into the disability sector. That's not our role. It never should be. I think that the success or failure of particularly new disability service organisations should be a function of the willingness of people with disability to pay them to offer those services.
You will see and be able to compare and contrast different models. What's it doing across the rest of the sector with a more traditional kind of business as the entrants like a Higher Up come in and mix up the market and the consumer expectations? What does that mean for the traditional players?
I don't think Higher Up itself would take direct credit for this concept, but we are seeing an increased focus on client matching amongst some of the longer term providers. Absolute kudos to them, providers which have remodeled their traditional business models to actually match the client to a worker who, for example, may have the same or similar interests. The importance of having qualified support workers to actually provide that specialist disability support, but insofar as they may also be a musician and the client wishes to actually learn how to play a musical instrument, well, that's a pretty good thing as well. There are other organisations I'm aware of which whose reason for being is not to provide specialist disability services, but to support people with disability to make community linkages. One of our members that I think of is Reclink AAA Play, which has about 1,300 different organisations as part of its web-based platform. Their reason for being is to support quote-unquote vulnerable Australians, not just people with disability, but also those with backgrounds of alcoholism, drug dependency, who've been clients of the justice system, et cetera, get back into the community by engaging in recreation and sport and the like, making the lives of people with disability better than they otherwise would have been.
Where we're talking about aged care and health and disabilities and in essence, a convergence towards a service across each of those that's a little bit more ubiquitous.
Philosophically, we consider to be working at its best is when the client is supported to no longer be a client, but just basically to be living in community.
Organisations that have travelled the journey for, as you said, sometimes 30, 50, 70 years in the disability space, are probably wrestling across the sector with what it means to mature their IT processes and architecture and systems. What do you see across the sector as organisations are wrestling with the disruption that IT is to their mature business?
Well, first of all, it's expensive to remodel. Secondly of all, the remodelling is not funded by the scheme. In order to actually engage with the scheme, you need to be doing that remodelling yourself at your own expense as an organisation. And I give our members and providers around Australia real credit for having undertaken that journey, because it was very, very difficult. Many of our larger members will have been doing this for years, but certainly our medium and smaller members, an enhanced awareness of the importance of a CRM over time has the capacity through machine learning and predictive analytics to actually support you to propose services that your clients might want or might not yet know they need. I'm increasingly going to be seeing a sector which is demanding or seeking workers who have the capacity to wield a mobile device like a weapon when it comes to being able to support people with disability, but also being able to work away from a centre. Almost 80% of our members who we surveyed on this question indicated that they'd moved from one-to-one to telehealth services in the provision of therapeutic supports. Many of them were wildly enthusiastic about the outcomes they were able to achieve by doing that, with having a wonderful conversation with one of our sector leaders in the early childhood intervention space. And she could not speak highly enough of the impact on telehealth on the ability of her organisation to provide support not just to the young child with autism who traditionally they're supporting, but also to the parents. Also, we saw some of our supported employment organisations pivoting to actually start providing goods and services, particularly goods, to support the effort to combat the pandemic, moving to manufacture hand sanitizer, and at the same time providing valued employment opportunities for people with disability. Post-pandemic, I'm absolutely confident that a number of the innovations that we saw during the COVID-19 will continue to become part of business as usual for many organisations, subject to, of course, the willingness and need of people with disability to continue using services in those ways.
Where some of those changes were rushed through by necessity because of COVID, there's going to need to be some backfill of due process and a little bit more rigour that follows that as a second wave.
We do argue that post-COVID-19, it's imperative that the sector have the opportunity to work with government and agencies to reflect on what worked, what didn't, and to understand what we need to do next. Funding of particular supports to ensure continuity of service during a pandemic needs to be done via a mechanism other than the one historically relied upon under the NDIS for getting paid. We certainly think there's a strong case for a national emergency and disaster fund with funding set aside to ensure, as far as is possible, continuity of support for people with disability, whether it be in a natural disaster like floods, bushfires, or a pandemic. What we don't want is the circumstances where people with disability are inhibited in their ability to get the services they need because we're working to a funding model which is intended to be fit for purpose when there isn't an emergency happening.
Yeah. David, it's interesting you go there. I was going to bring up the National Cabinet, beside that the NDIA. What can you tell us about the themes that are coming out of those bodies as to where these changes might go over the coming years?
We're pleased that the Disability Reform Council, which is comprised of the disability ministers of all Australian governments, including the Commonwealth, continues to meet. Its establishment is expressly referenced in the NDIS Act, and certainly what we're seeing from all Australian governments through that process is an understanding of the importance of a consistent, if not uniform, approach to key elements of the National Disability Insurance Scheme and its regulation. Certainly from our point of view, a missed opportunity was in the area of worker screening. Whilst there is a consistent approach to worker screening policy, the fact that every state and territory government is responsible for administering screening in its own way, we think has the real potential to create gaps which can lead to disaster, depending upon which border you're crossing. That leaves open the possibility of people who we don't want in the sector, and people with disability should never have to actually deal with, let alone speak to, creeping into the sector. We have continued to make a strong case nationally for those gaps to be filled, and we will continue to do so. We also have been actively engaged with the Department of Social Services and its leadership on the development of a national NDIS workforce action plan. The development of a workforce in terms of its quantum, in terms of its size, which is capable of meeting service demand, is a critical piece of business for financial disability services and our members. On current estimates, we need to actually grow the sector by near enough to 120,000 FTE.
That's significant.
That is significant. It used to be 90,000 FTE was the upper limit. But of course, with the number of temporary visa holders who've now gone home as a result of the pandemic, the FTE figure's blown out. So let's look at that as the challenge, but let's also look at that as the opportunity. And what we continue to say through the NDIS Workforce Action Plan process is that it represents a real opportunity to turbocharge the Australian economy and provide jobs of the future for people who wanting to work in the fastest growing sector in the Australian economy, being the disability sector. And growing the workforce to meet demand, and also growing the workforce in ways which provides career pathing, professional opportunities and the like. At NDS, we have a National Disability Practitioner Initiative, NDP, which has more than 15,000 individuals as members, which is all about supporting their professionalisation through a range of courses, training, webinars and the like. We have a very significant learning and development program for the sector more widely, which again is intended to support our members in particular, but providers more generally, to understand what quality looks like when it comes to service provision and how to get there. I mean, there are challenges in terms of, first of all, settling on what qualifications, if any, we require to actually enter the sector. I mean, we don't want artificial barriers being established to people entering the sector by requiring qualifications which may or may not be useful in the provision of day-to-day disability services and support. There is an opportunity which needs to be taken to actually develop training courses, micro courses and the like that can support disability support workers, therapists and others in the sector, and management in the sector, to improve the quality of the work they're doing, and by reason of that, support people with disability to improve their own lives.
I'm guessing you're close to doing another survey of your members, and interested in what you anticipate you'll see through that. Perhaps with the part-time, full-time mix, the gender balance. What themes do you guess we'll see out of this year's survey in a fascinating time?
In fact, our annual market survey, which supports the release of our State of the Disability Sector report, our annual market survey will be released next week. And will be in the field for 4 weeks. Based upon previous years, we would expect well in excess of 600 sector leaders to respond to that report. That is a very influential report in terms of the messages it delivers to government and to the agency and to the Quality and Safeguarding Commission, and also to other Australian governments other than the Commonwealth. I would hope we'd see this year, based upon recent trends, a continuing diminution in the rate of casualisation in the sector. At the moment, the sector is still sitting at about 36% casualisation. Which is about 3 times the national average when it comes to casualisation. I think we've seen through the pandemic the dangers of precarious work, the instability and the economic hardship. I think we need a mix of different employment types. One of the challenges of casualisation is it doesn't always lead to consistency of support for the person with disability, which is fundamental and should be in ensuring that they're getting a high quality of support. So I think we're going to see an increasing number of women in leadership positions within the sector, which I think is a great thing, despite my gender and the fact that I'm in a leadership position. I'd like to be able to say that we're going to see a more culturally diverse sector, because I think one of the challenges for our sector is having people in the sector from CALD backgrounds, culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and also, and at least as importantly as anything else, having a significant cohort of workers from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. People who are culturally competent by definition, culturally sensitive by definition, and who are able to work comfortably in community and to be embraced by those communities. Certainly that's something I'd like to see in the survey. I'm not sure if we will. I think we'll see a sector which has had some hard yards in terms of economics, in terms of cash reserves, cash flow and the like. As a result of the pandemic, we acknowledge and thank the federal government for its JobKeeper initiative, which has been the lifeblood of many providers. I think what we haven't seen so far, interestingly, is the entrance into the sector of very large for-profit organisations. Okay. At one point, the sector had, I think, an expectation that with the marketisation of disability services, that it would attract the interest of large overseas for-profits.
And what do you put that down to, David, that hasn't played out?
Prices which aren't economic for those for-profits. Certainly a signal to the agency as the price setter that perhaps the prices need to be more commercial than they are. I mean, I say that acknowledging, and as a taxpayer myself, that the prices are set as a function of funding available, and that funding is provided with the consent of the Australian taxpayer. And that's why I think it's important that National Disability Services continues with our members to have a strong and influential voice nationally, because these are complex issues which must have the strong input and influence of disability service providers, the organisations on the front line providing services, and who by definition therefore have a pretty forensic understanding of what's going on in the sector, what works and what doesn't.
David, it's a fascinating time to be alive, perhaps tumultuous economically, socially, change everywhere, disruption all over the place, and that will just continue to be the norm. What's your encouragement or your exhaustion out into the sector as we face into that?
In the midst of the pandemic, our sector was described in some quarters by government as being very resilient. That's a statement with which I would strongly agree. And that resilience comes from a willingness on the part of disability service providers to actually do everything they possibly can that is humanly possible to do to ensure continuity of services, whether it's a pandemic, a bushfire, a flood, or any other natural disaster. Ours is a sector which every day lives and breathes the importance of supporting people with disability to lead ordinary lives, to achieve the independence that everybody in the community wants to achieve. And certainly from the point of view of National Disability Services and our members, we think that our sector, living the values that it does, has the capacity to deliver great value for all Australians and be part of the economy of the future.
David Moody, CEO of NDIS, thank you very much. That's a great way to finish the conversation today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Daniel.